My name is Biswajit Sharma. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Muturi Satyanarayana Center, who's hosting today's talk by Professor Mahesh Rangarajan. Before we move on to the talk and to introduce today's speaker, may I request Professor Mahapatra, who's the director of our center, to say a few words about the center. Thank you.
First of all, I wish to welcome each one of you to our talk. There's also a very special warm welcome to Professor Mahesh Rangarajan for the sake of history, for an important piece of information, is that Professor Rangarajan is connected with Muturi Satyanarayana Center for Advanced Study in the Humanities and Social Science right at the very beginning. In fact, he was a former vice chancellor of Kriya University. The MOU was actually signed when Professor Rangarajan was the vice chancellor. And the first set of fellows that actually were selected when Professor Rangarajan was still the vice chancellor. And I'm delighted to welcome him back. And this center is very new in the sense that it effectively started towards the end of 2021, and so it's more than a year old. And we have today 6 postdoctoral fellows working in different areas, some on environmental history, some on colonial, pre-colonial linguistics, on history of race and science, history of railway, on history of telegraph in colonial India, and so on. So the postdoctoral program is currently the main program of the center, but we also have done a series of talks right from the beginning, very beginning, and on the issue of languages, linguistics, diminishment of languages, and stuff like that. And the recent one that we did last month is on city. And now I reckon that we would have a series of talks on environment and environmental history. So I'm delighted to welcome you to this talk. And I'm very happy that as far as this series is concerned, we have Professor Rangarajan, who's going to speak to us today. Biswajit, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Mahapatra. Professor Rangarajan doesn't really need introduction, but just to keep the tradition on, Professor Rangarajan teaches history and environmental studies at Ashoka University, Haryana. He studied at Hindu College in Delhi University, then at Balliol and Nuffield colleges in Oxford. His first book, Sensing the Forest, was published in 1996. Most recent works include Nature and Nation in 2015, a collection of his almost 2-decade essays spanning 2 decades on forestry, wildlife, political ecology, etc. And his co-edited works include in the 2 volumes of India's environmental history, which was published by Permanent Black in 2012. Nature Without Borders, that came up in 2014, Shifting Ground, that came up in 2014, and at Nature's Is in 2018. A co-edited work with title Nature Contested is in press. So over to you, Professor Rangarajan, now.
Thank you very much for a very kind and warm introduction, Professor Mahapatra, Dr. Sarma, and the fellows and associates of Muturi Satyanarayana Center for Advanced Study of Social Sciences and Humanities. It's, of course, a privilege and pleasure to be back at Kriya, but it is also especially a privilege and pleasure to be speaking at this center. I'm told this is its first lecture, which is a privilege, but it is one I approach with some sense of humility. I say this because there are very few centers in this country dedicated to the advanced study of humanities and social sciences. And to the best of my knowledge, this is the first one in a long time that has been set up in any university. It's a testament to the vision of the family of late freedom fighter Muturi Satyanarayana Garu and his family and the leadership of the university. And I'm sure that the first set of fellows, there will be many more fellows, are going to set a very high standard for the future. The study of social sciences, humanities, of course, includes the discipline of history. And historians are fond of saying, when asked a question, that I think I might be able to help with the answer, but that the answer is long and that it's complicated. So historians are people who like to think that we have a long-term view, and we like to think that we have complex explanations about when, where, how change happens over time. That's what historians study. We try to find out in what ways the past shaped the present, and the ways in which humans remake nature, and in turn how nature, there are many ways of defining nature, they are very contested, but for now I'll use the short form nature. The ways in which humans remake nature, and the way nature adapts, evolves, and changes. This set of interactions has never been as central to the human predicament or the human condition as it is today. Just over half century ago, there was an idea at the first UN conference on the human environment at Stockholm. And the slogan was "Only One Earth." But it's notable that only two heads of state found time, or heads of government found time to be at the conference. But perhaps more than symbolic, one was from a highly developed nation state, Sweden, and the other was from a developing one, India. So when we look at the recent G20 summit by contrast, held in 2023, where leaders of 20 nation states were present, and the 21st joined them, that is the African Union is going to be candidate member, will join in future summits. Along with deliberations on the questions of war and peace, along with the questions of world economic stability, they looked at the problems of global environmental change, namely mainly climate change driven by human action. And of course, as the case at Stockholm, there was recognition that all humans everywhere do not have the same environmental footprint. And there are great disparities as well as differences, not just within, but between nation states. In any such story of the globe, India looms large. It's very recently that India passed a very important landmark. This was one of the fears in 1972, that populations of developing countries will grow, that the neo-Malthusian nightmare will overwhelm the global environment. 1972 conference, after all, met in the shadow of the book, The Population Bomb, by the California ecologists Paul and Anne Ehrlich. And today, one can say the neo-Malthusian nightmare never quite came to bear, but it's true that India has now overtaken China. India is the most populous nation on earth today. But it is not only the number of people in India that makes it important. It is the economic transformation of India, particularly from the 1950s, more so from the 1980s on. And there are those who would point to an uptick. Some would say the 90s, the early years of reform. Some would do 2000s, and others would point to the better part of the last decade. Whichever of these one takes, it is a fact that the rate of economic expansion of India, the production of goods and services, makes it very important in global terms, but it also means that more Indians eating better, living longer, consuming more, purchasing more, will mean more imports, particularly of fuel, and I refer to oil, gas, and interestingly, coal. It also means that the events and practices within India, the environmental footprints of different sets of Indians, north and south, east and west, in the great mountain range of the Himalaya, the Trans-Himalaya, in the river valley of the Indus, Ganga, Brahmaputra, the largest area of cultivable lowland in well-watered, snow-melt-fed rivers in the whole of Asia, the largest other than the Huangpo Yangtze, as well as the patchwork of different microclimates and ecologies of the peninsula, and the great coastline, because India abuts on the Indian Ocean, one of the very important oceans in world trade. What happens within this zone will have enormous implications in ecological terms for the globe. My friends who are biologists like reminding me that when we speak of India, it is not only a country of 22 national languages, another 35 yearning or requesting or demanding recognition. It's also a country of over 430 kinds of mammals, over 1,200 varieties of birds, 100,000 varieties of plants, half of them flowering, uh, uh, variety of fish and reptiles, over 1,000 species each. And the ways in which India and Indians, plant and animal, four-legged or two-legged, flying or crawling, work out ways to coexist or not coexist, will have a lot to bear on how the Earth deals with the question not only of climate change, but also of biological diversity. One of the features, of course, of India is that because of its sheer size, any statement that one makes about India, and I'm, of course, quoting the great Joan Robinson, who said that any statement about India is true, but so is the opposite. So I want to qualify whatever I'm going to say. My own expertise is limited. It is on the late 19th to the late 20th century. I was trained as a student of late imperial history, but it's obvious that one cannot look at the environmental history of India as a tabula rasa. It didn't begin in 1857, 58, or for that matter in 1757, one fine day when India became part of the British Empire, or after the Battle of Palashi. Nor did it begin in the 16th century with the creation of the Mughal siyasa. One would have to go backward in time and recognize that the human presence and imprint on the landscapes and waterscapes of India, or if I may use the term South Asia, and I'm referring to the former British Indian Empire, prior to 1937, that would include the present-day states of Pakistan, Bangladesh, Burma, and India, with very important generalizations, which cannot possibly exclude Nepal, Bhutan, and perhaps even Sri Lanka. This particular region has certain very interesting features which long predate the colonial, imperial, or if you like, the era of the independent nation state. One of them, of course, is the enormous criticality of natural cycles, which have political, economic, and cultural implications. We are living through one of the driest summers on record in North Indian plains. The months of August and September have seen low precipitation, which may affect the Rabi sowing, perhaps leading to food price inflation in the winter, particularly of pulses. So when we look at grain cultivation and the growing of dal, it's very easy to forget that South Asia is probably one of the very few places of the world where a huge amount of protein intake comes from pulses. So, dal makhni may be Punjabi, Haryanvi dish, but the different types of dal, rajma, chole, they are very particular to this subcontinent as a major source of protein. The other, of course, is that rainfall failures, other than the monsoon, may also affect sustenance adversely. My distinguished colleague in the place I worked in long, at the University of Delhi, Dr. Prabhu Mahapatra, wrote a very widely quoted paper on Chota Nagpur, where he showed that in the early 20th century, because of high revenue, the peasantry, caste Hindu as well as tribal, Adivasi, started cultivating what were called Dawn and Tanar lands. These were marginal lands. They were not amenable to cultivation. They produced reasonably good crop for a few years, and then the crop failed. And he traces the failure of the crop to the failure of the winter rains. You see, it rains in winter for just 10, 12 days, but those rains are very critical. So I think the continuing importance of precipitation levels, with precipitation concentrated in a very specific time of the year, is a very important feature of monsoon ecologies and systems. There are about 20 odd countries in Asia, and all of South Asia comes within it. Those of you who are in Kriya University are, of course, exceptionally privileged. You are within the area of the former Madras Presidency on the Coromandel, which is the only part of India which receives rainfall from two monsoons, southwest and northeast. But because of this issue of precipitation, and because of the long history of rice cultivation, we have a history of rice paddy cultivation going back in some form over 4,000 years, 4,000 BCE, which is around 6,000 years ago. In parts of northern India. And the varieties of rice grown in India, many of them, their yield goes up substantially if the land is terraced, if the water is stored. So investment in terracing, enormous amount of human capital and labor, is very clear in, for instance, the hills of Uttarakhand, studied by Dr. Vasudha Pandey, when the Champa rice comes in, almost 800 years ago. So I'm trying to draw a very important point out here that the remaking of landscapes is not a new phenomenon. You see similar very intensive rice cultivation in parts of the Konkan. Shomit Guha actually argues that where there is rice paddy, there'll be hierarchy. There'll be hierarchies of labor. There'll be hierarchies of investment. You'd need huge amount of work in order to have the paddy seedling, transplant it, have it in standing water, protect the water, keep it in the channels and bring it in. And so this whole issue of cultivation, and I refer to rice just as a particular instance, requires not only human investment, but different forms of organization. And where the surplus is so large, hierarchies will often be more marked. There's a very interesting point, which is that historically, irrigation across South Asia, and I'm referring particularly to arid and semi-arid South Asia, about 40-45% is arid and semi-arid. Delhi is very much within that zone. In these areas, the cultivation would often be of millets, of wheat, and of crops that could do with low amount of precipitation. There's a huge transformation where it was possible to store water and irrigate the land. But no changes that were brought about with surface irrigation have had quite the impact of something we take for granted today, the tube well. The tube well and the tractor actually made their dramatic appearance in much of the Indian landscape only in the late 1960s. And today, just about 60 odd years later, 2/3 of the land is irrigated with groundwater, and well over 80% of the draft power is provided by the tractor. In North India, where I work, outside the university where I go in, there is a very interesting tractor park with a very lovely name, Sonalika. It means the golden one. It's a tractor developed by CSIR. It's a small tractor. So, the small tractor and the tube well were symbols of a fundamental transformation, which was to enable double cropping to spread into new areas, generate jobs, incomes, raise yields, but draw out the groundwater much more rapidly than it was being recharged. And this is a feature of a very large part of arid, semi-arid India. It is also incidentally a feature of large parts of the United States and China. But historically, the keeping of water by building tanks, by sinking wells, by laying canals, by building check dams in the hills has been very important and has taken two forms. In some cases, peasants could get together and pool their labor and keep it. In others, it could be done by rulers. One of her most important works, Professor Kathy Morrison, has written a remarkable paper on Dharma and sacred reservoirs in India. It's a very presently unfashionable figure, but a book which is still widely read. It was written in jail. Unlike all of us who write on laptop, we write a page, then we say delete. A person in a political prisoner in jail was given ration paper. And because there was ration paper, I don't know if the ink was rationed, in 1942 to 1945, the 1200 pages of the manuscript became a book in Hindi called Bharat Ek Khoj and in English called The Discovery of India. And this book refers somewhere to the building of the tanks as very important activity by rulers in medieval South India. Many years later, the author, you also have guessed, Jawaharlal Nehru, was to use the term temples of modern India. This is a very major issue on which he is pilloried for valorizing big dams against small. But as Morrison points out, he may not have been very cognizant of South Indian history. But the Vijayanagar kingdom, which he has studied, or empire, between the 1300s and late 16th century, there's a series of dryland reservoirs which are built, many of which are intact to this day. Now, this is very important to emphasize that there is a big difference between the river systems of Peninsula and those of North India. The North Indian ones are dependent on snowmelt from the Himalayas, where the southern are largely perennial. Therefore, the building of dams, one could think of the Chola Anicut, is not anything novel or new. What is remarkable of the Vijayanagar check dams is that they led to significant changes in local hydrology and in the crop pattern. They led to concentrations of population and to many changes we associate with modernity, such as the cultivation of marginal zones, overutilization of soil, degradation of the landscape, and denudation. But there were also corrective methods. There were new crops introduced and better systems of tillage and soil fertility renewal. So there's a much longer history we see of investment in irrigation systems. Just to cite one more very fascinating example, David Hardiman looked at small dam systems maintained by Bhils in the Sahyadris, which broke down sometime in the 1840s. And one of the reasons, which is very significant, is that earlier rulers had given takavi loans, something everyone in this room will dream of, a zero interest or low interest loan. Imagine if someone gave you a loan with 0% interest or 2% interest. We'd all jump in. Well, those loans continued under the Marathas, but they dried up after the British took charge of these areas after 1818. He also shows there were changes in the way revenue was assessed, and many of these dams today have fallen into disuse. I bring this up because it's important to keep in mind this much longer history of farming, herding, of ways in which the uncultivated arable was managed in the period prior to the company polity in the late 18th century and the coming of British Raj in the late 19th century. There is sometimes a tendency, particularly in a lot of literature by policymakers and activists alike, to see the period prior to that as one of golden age of village communities. But if one looks very carefully at the superb fine-grained work on the long-term history of state building in India, that picture really does not stand to scrutiny. What better way to illustrate that than a very fascinating animal, which we are all familiar with, the horse. Many people here may not have heard of the great book by a historian who tragically died a few years ago, very close to his beloved Nizamuddin, the late Professor Simon Digby. Digby wrote a book called War, Horse and Elephant in the Delhi Sultanate in 1970s. The revised copy is lying with a press in another country, which will remain nameless, but they're just sitting on it, which is a tragedy. Well, you may or may not have read the book, but you would have heard the following song. It's from a very famous film made by Shekhar Kapoor, Masoom. Lakdi ki kati, kati pe ghoda, etc., etc. It's a song sung by little boy and two girls. They are singing about a wooden horse. And it says, Lakdi ki kati, kati pe ghoda, ghode ke dum pe jo mara hathoda, doda, doda, ghoda, doda, dum utha ke doda. We tapped the wooden horse and look how it rocked and ran. What many people tend to miss is that the author Gulzar Sahab is very deeply knowledgeable in Farsi, Urdu, and Punjabi. And so he inserted the following line. घोड़ा अपना तगड़ा है, देखो कैसी चर्बी है, चरता है मेहरौली में पर घोड़ा अपना अरबी है. Look at our horse, how sleek he is. He grazes in the fields of Mehroli, but he's a true Arab horse. And the import of Arab, Turki, and Irani horses took place from the overland route to Afghanistan and the famous passes of the Khyber and Bolan, which school children in India had to mug up in their exams, and also across the sea route. And this sea route horses trotted across, as Manuji tells us, also to the kingdom of Vijayanagar. Well, horses were to then what a Cadillac would be today, wouldn't it? Right into the 19th century, the class of a person could be told by which horse they rode. If you were a well-off member of the landed gentry aristocracy, you rode an Arabic or Turki or Irani horse. The local zamindars and others had to make do with the janglas, local horses, whose breeding was quite important. Right into the early 20th century, in the writings of William Tone, the brother of the Irish Revolutionary Wolfe Tone. William Tone was a mercenary with the Marathas. His article was published in Asiatic Researches, quoted also by Professor Sumit Guha, and Wolfe Tone tried to compute how many horses the Marathas put into battle. He came up with astounding figures. Similar figures have been calculated by Professor Jos Gomans for the number of horses in the 1840s. Many of these were imported. They were paid for, believe it or not, in silver. So India paid for the import of horses in silver. And as Trotman and Digby have both pointed out, there's a very simple rule with horses. The further east you went in the Gangetic Plain, the worse the quality of the horses became. Because half of India was in the arid zone, while the eastern half could very crudely be labeled as monsoon Asia. Here, there was a pattern where the yield per acre was higher. Sweet water was abundant, both in the surface and in the ground. And the structures of labor provision were different. India never had permanent nomadic communities, though it had large numbers of itinerant groups. The itinerant groups would move from place to place. But please note, many of the best horses historically have been imported. These imports break down for two sets of reasons. In the 1830s and 40s, there was a series of wars in Afghanistan, culminating eventually in the first Anglo-Afghan War, 1839 to 42. So the link by which the horses came in broke down. The other reason is very important. Right up to the 19th century, the 1820s in Western India, the 1850s in North India, soldiers were available for hire. In today's world, we would call them mercenaries, but this is a somewhat pejorative term. These were soldiers who fought. They kept some of the loot or the plunder, and they were not regular armed soldiers. They were expert fighters who were available. They were even hired by many of the tribal polities, such as the Gonds and the Bhils. They fought on the sides of different armies, Maratha, Mughal, and believe it or not, British and French. Many of them had their own horses. Now, over time, as the company set up its own armies and expanded, and later the British Empire, they did not want these independent horse breeders. My doctoral student, Oritri Chakrabarti, is working right now on animal economy of colonial and imperial India and looking at the politics of horse supply in Eastern India. She comes up with a very interesting insight. Many of the horses were whalers brought from New South Wales, but there were others, horses, which were bred particularly for mountain warfare in the areas of North Bengal. So it's not that Indians couldn't breed horses, but they couldn't breed these particular top class horses. The other animal, of course, is even more interesting because the sets of relationships around it are significant. But before I come to that, I want to emphasize that the movement of armies, horses, required supply. Anyone who has had talk with something now extinct in India, the Tanga Wala, and since we are into Hindi cinema, those who are interested in conflict between Tanga, that is horse-drawn cart, and modern motor car bus, internal combustion engine, may be advised to see a superb film called Ala, in which Amitabh Bachchan plays the role of a doomed Tangawala, who in his spare time sings, believe it or not, Hindustani vocal singing. He sings quite well, but I won't tell you the end. But it does end with the extinguishing of the Tanga trade. Now, the Tanga horse is not very high in the rank as horse hierarchies go. But any Tangawala would tell you that Tanga horses also cannot just be fed grass and hay. They have to be given chana, that is lentils. So these horses required a supply of lentils and pulses. So these horse-borne armies and horses which were used by soldiers also required an economy which had lentils and pulses. Ditto for the commissariats. Right into the mid-19th century, a lot of the grain and salt was brought by armed Banjaras, who have been the subject of a lot of historical research. As late as the 1840s, in the Anglo-Sikh Wars, the contractor Tory Mull could bring over 40,000 Banjara cattle. These are cattle who are pack bullocks. They could move across the Deccan in areas where there were no tracks for the bullock cart. So when we look at the bullock cart, we should remember bullock carts are very specific in time and place. And historically, it's the Banjaras who had these huge tandas. If you go back some time, and you know, the 1620s, Jahangir, composing the Jahangir Nama, writes about coming across one tanda with 280,000 pack bullocks. So India, even today, has a disproportionately large number of the domestic ruminants. About 22% of domestic ruminants live in India, which is only 2.4% of the landscape. But one big change is that earlier the ruminants were kept for transport, the Banjara pack bullock, later the bullock cart. They were also kept for transport in other forms. In Western India, it would be the camel. In parts of Eastern India, elephants were very important. District collectors, deputy collectors, Gunel Sederloff and Saikia, two leading historians of Northeast, tell us how over 1/3 of Assam lowlands is underwater for 4 to 5 months a year. So to get from one village to the other, people may use boats, but the collector or the people in the commissariat, they used elephants. So animal traction would be very important in the 1860s when the railway came. But it would not die out even into the 1920s. And we must keep in mind for draft power right to the 1960s. So if one wants to look at state power and state making and the political economies of production, exchange, and transport, while horses may have faded out earlier, the bull, the bullock, the buffalo remained in the picture for much longer. Related to this, of course, is the fact that when we look at India, we tend to use certain stereotypes. India is a nation of villages, and the sedentary village has been a favorite of writers. You can go back to the great Kantapura novel of Ramarao. You can look at various village-based novels, Munshi Premchand in the north. In the south, there is a range of writings, a very moving book, The Village Before Time, by the great Malayali journalist and writer K. Madhavan. But it's significant to keep in mind that right into the 19th century, India had an astonishingly large population that was itinerant or peripatetic. This was to cause a lot of consternation to those who were surveying not only the land and populations, but were trying to administer the early principalities taken over by the British, the great presidencies of Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. And as the power of first East India Company and the British expanded into the subcontinent across much of Asia, there were two kinds of questions they were concerned. One, that some of the people who moved around were armed. So I referred already to the disarming that took place in the 1820s and 1850s. But the other was a very closely related pattern of attempting to sedentarize peoples. This was by no means new. There's very interesting work on Mughal attempts to sedentarize and the Sultanate attempts to sedentarize in North India. And there are doubtless counterparts elsewhere. However, peripatetic peoples, particularly by providing grain, salt, or information, as in the case of the Banjaras, or serving in armies as scouts or as keepers of the passes, which was the case of Gonds, Bhils, and many of the Adivasi peoples, what were later classified Adivasi peoples in Western India, had much less use for the new state formation that was to come about. Guha in his work argues that cartography was far more advanced in the case of the European rulers than had been the case of the Mughals or the Marathas. And further to this, after the 1860s and 70s, we see a fairly substantial remaking of the state in India. There are lineages earlier, such as the Bhils of Khandesh and the attempts first to recruitment in the armies and later to sedentarize them by giving them plows. Once they had plows, they would settle in one place. It would be easier to assess them, to check the yield per unit acre, to collect taxes, and also to ensure, quote unquote, that it did not get up to mischief. In my own work in the Gir Hills, I found in the 1840s, there were attempts to get the settlers, those who lived within the Gir Hills, into a set of settlements where they could be kept under watch and not get up to any trouble. So there is a sort of a relationships of surveillance, sedentarization, assessment, which would not be unusual for anyone who studies European history. Those who grew up on the novels of Enid Blyton would remember the characters like Jo, who was a gypsy, who's identified, it's quite racist by the way, by her smell, but also by her remarkable agility, her wild nature, the fact that she could climb up climb up a tower into the window by the creeper. And this kind of notion that vagrancy, peripatetic, are not only unproductive and lawless, but they need a firm hand, would be evident also in the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871. At one stage, some 40% of the population of UP was classified as CT. And in southern India, as Meena Radhakrishna shows us, groups like salt carriers, once salt carrying became a colonial monopoly, an imperial monopoly rather, they were classified as criminals. So there is a very interesting set of changes in society. And with the censuses of 1881 and numbers, you also start getting a labeling of large sections of the population. It's no coincidence then that in the 1860s and 70s, in the wake of the railway timber crisis, that you get the formation and expansion of the forest department. This is something I studied in my doctorate and I still find fascinating. So I'll check myself with only 2 points, which is that by the early years of the 20th century, something like 600,000 square kilometers had become government forest estate. This is the largest forest estate in the whole of the world. Its role was of the forest department was not just the supply of timber for the railways, it's to collect revenues, it's to organize labor, it was to manipulate forest succession in order to increase the supply of commercially and strategically valuable species such as the sal, the deodar, or the teak. The foresters were naturalists par excellence. Many of them were sport hunters. At least 2 deserve mention at a time when India, Indians, and Asians spending so much time trying to save the tiger. One was Captain Alan Dunbar Brander in the Central Provinces, who for 6 years put away his gun and studied various animals. His book is particularly interesting because it has some photos of some of the largest tigers you'll ever see, except when you look carefully, every single tiger was first shot dead and then it was photographed. Dunbar Brander expressed great concern about what he called the degeneration of tigers. Lest you think this is about their morality, it's about the decline in size. He was scared sportsmen were shooting all the big tigers and there'd be no small, there wouldn't be enough big tigers for the future. Other was more interesting, a man called F.W. Champion, who stopped hunting entirely after his experiences in the frontier, where he served in the army at the end of the Second World War. He joined the Forest Service, and in the 1920s pioneered camera trap photography of tigers, recognizing each by their stripes and unwittingly setting the template for the way tigers are assessed today. I bring these up just to point out that one cannot look at colonialism and imperialism purely through the lens of blood and gore. And one of the very important dimensions of British forestry and natural history is that it laid down a very large treasure trove of information and study which remains valuable to this day. But this remaking of the forest cannot be seen on its own unless one brings into the picture a parallel change. These are rarely seen together. But starting in the 1840s, when Punjab was brought under British rule, they defeated the successors of Ranjit Singh. And Punjab very quickly becomes where they create the canal colonies. One of the most famous short stories of Kipling, the author who gave us Mowgli, was called The Undertakers. It's about the British who shoot the ferocious animals and birds which live along a river. He shoots a man-eating crocodile and builds a bridge. Well, besides bridges, they cut and build canals. The canal colonies transformed the land of the 5 rivers. These were areas where they settled. The groups who were classified as martial races, they remained loyal in 1857. There were the Punjabi Musalmans, the Jat Sikhs, and the Hindu Jats, particularly in the areas now Haryana. And these were assigned to peasant colonists who then supplied soldiers. And to this day in Pakistan, in the Punjab, as well as in Indian Punjab, Haryana, you can go to villages where there are families who have 3, 4, 5 generations who have served, first in the British Army, Indian Army, and then in the armies of Pakistan and India. In one of the most remarkable works that's been written, Professor Niladri Bhattacharya calls this the Great Agrarian Conquest. He reminds us that the remaking of the land in Punjab, just as the remaking of the forest, led to the erasure of many older ways of life. So an agro-sylvic cultural pastoral system, where there was an intimate relationship between herder communities or herders and herding as a peripatetic nomadic activity. And cultivation was snapped. So earlier the herders would come in seasonally and put their sheep and goats in the fields where there was stubble. They would be paid, believe it or not, paid, so that the field would get fertilized. And after a couple of weeks or 3 weeks, they would move on. The stubble had been cleared, the dung would remain. And drawing on present-day scholarship, Professor Bhattacharya hypothesizes that in the short run, many of these colonies yielded very high yields. Over time, the nitrogen-potassium content went down because these links were snapped. He doesn't tell us, but we know that in the 1960s, when Field Marshal Ayub Khan, at that time a great darling of the West, because guided democracy was seen as better than electoral democracy, he's a recipient of a lot of arms aid, made a famous trip to Washington, D.C. And since I am talking of animals, the big magazines put photograph of a very beautiful white stallion, which he presented to First Lady Jackie Kennedy. But his major billing was to ask for a lot of arms aid. But the smaller meeting was equally significant. In a very important book on long-term Indo-US relations, it's pointed out that he wanted a lot of money from US Agency for International Development for treating the salt-encrusted sands of the canal colonies. So this relentless supply of water without providing for drainage led to changes in the water table, and very large areas of land became salt-encrusted and unproductive. So there were longer-term unintended consequences. This is similarly true of the forest. just as the British had classified populations into martial races, like the people in the Punjab, and they had put another set of people in criminal tribes, they did too with animals as well. Large numbers of animals and species from the 1870s, drawing on earlier colonial practice, were classified as dangerous beasts. These included animals which are spectacular, which we today see as icons of conservation. The lion, killed a lion in Kota in the 1870s, would be given the reward of 20 rupees. Killed a tiger, it would be 10 rupees. In Tirunelveli in South India, many numbers of cheetahs were killed, the most southernmost limit of the cheetah. And what's common to all three of these is that they were carnivores. They were seen as creatures which ate people, or livestock, or both. Similarly, there were attempts to wipe out animals such as wolves, jackals, and otters. Conversely, however, the British protect certain game animals such as the deer or the jungle fowl, which were good eating and which were important as trophies. I say this because these categories of game and vermin, martial race and criminal tribe, strange and quaint and stereotypically, archetypically colonial as they may seem, these ideas and categories were imbibed by many of the dominant groups and classes in India. It should not surprise you to know that princely states gave out rewards, as did Kota, that filling up the members of martial races would be important for many of the princely states, such as Kolhapur or Baroda, or for that matter, for Patiala in North India. So what we think of as imperial and colonial definitely also had Indians buying into that way of thinking. Today, we valorize, and quite rightly so, very important Indian who in the 1920s added to the nationalist critique of imperial politics, about coercive aspects of rule, denial of civil liberties, brute force, particularly at the end of the First World War, Jallianwala Bagh massacre. He added an economic critique. I refer to Gandhi and his ideas of self-reliance, the village community, of handicrafts, of India trying to carve out a different model of a society. I'm not using the term economy and growth because he never used them. His follower did, J.C. Kumarappa, on whom Professor Ram Guha has done such important work. Venu Madhav Govindu has co-authored a superb book on the thought of Kumarappa. And Kumarappa in the 30s and 40s hypothesized that an economy which was built on local self-reliance, artisanal production, local production of basic cloth through hand-woven, hand-spun cloth, growing pulses, lentils, and grains and fruits and vegetables would be the way forward. In the 1940s, along with his colleagues, Kumarappa also looked at biomass cultivation, biomass energy, and attempted what were probably some of the first biogas plants circulating in South Asia. Kumarappa's, however, was only one kind of vision, and I want to emphasize its roots lay not only in Hind Swaraj, Gandhiji's famous book of 1909, but also in the letter oft quoted 1928 by Gandhi to another Gujarati, actually a Parsi, the MP in the House of Commons, Saklatwala, where he wrote, and I paraphrase, that if India adopts the path of England, it will wear the tiger stripes without the tiger. We'll strip the earth like a pack of locusts. You can't get a better critique of modern industrialism and its possible global impact in terms of the wipeout of resources and the disastrous consequences for humanity and nature alike than that can be. So whether he used the term ecology, environment or not, there is clearly a notion of an ethic of industrialism and consumerism is destructive in Gandhi. Well, there's news for us. Writing in the 1930s, the very brilliant physicist from Bengal, Dr. Meghnad Saha, who went on to be a socialist parliamentarian, argued that Kumarappa had it all wrong. There's no point having Purna Swaraj, complete independence, without the means to defend it. And for the means to defend it, he argued that you needed the sinews of a modern economy. He was quite clear in how you define the sinews of modern economy. I've written it down because it's all in production systems. It's in kilowatt hours, modern, that is energy production. The kilos of nitrogenous fertilizers, so chemical fertilizers, and the amount of steel and iron. So iron and steel, ammonia-based fertilizers, and abundant supplies of energy were important to provide the artifices of a modern industrial economy. Otherwise, India would not be able to protect its political independence. Interestingly, this was well in the line of the idea of a modern economy, articulated by two men who would soon be at loggerheads in politics, but they agreed on their broad economic outlook, the president of the Congress Party, Subhash Chandra Bose, and the later president of the Congress Party and first Prime Minister of Independent India, Jawaharlal Nehru. But they were not alone. If one looks at the politics of the 1940s, as we all know, Nehru ended up in jail. Subhash Bose set up the Azad Hind Fauj. And another set of Indians decided to work with the British. They thought that it was better to gain experience in statecraft, to work for upliftment and transformation of their own section of society by engaging with the imperial power. For one of them, emancipation could not be looked at in terms of the nation, particularly for his own community, which was hardly treated in humane terms by their own fellow people. And I refer to Dr. Ambedkar, who served as labor member of the Viceroy's Executive Council. Ambedkar, as you perhaps know, picked up a project which was deeply beloved to Dr. Saha, the Damodar Valley Corporation. The Damodar Valley Corporation was inspired by the Tennessee Valley Authority. The idea was to build a series of dams of the Damodar, prevent it from flooding the land. So here the problem was not of the absence of water, as in Western and Southern India, as much of an excess of water. Those of you who read Amar Chitra Katha comics, not so fashionable now, but available, I believe, on a CD-ROM and in various digital forms. There's lovely 2 pages showing young Meghnad Saha finding it very difficult to go to school because of the flood waters. And he's very brave. He manages to go to school and get back. And it is part of the legend of Saha that when he worked in physics department, Presidency College, he did a lot of calculations on floods. And of course, he published a paper on it. So this idea of taming the flood waters is important. That to people as diverse as the socialist Meghnad Saha and the preeminent politician of Dalit emancipation and of ideas of social emancipation in Indian 20th century India, Dr. Ambedkar. There's a counterpart in Western India who's from a completely different category. He was an ardent tiger hunter, Ganga Singh of Bikaner, one of the very few Indians who attended the Treaty of Versailles and signed it as a delegate. On an aside, one of the people he sat next to was the host. Versailles is in France. His host was Premier Clemenceau, great war hero. And speaking through an interpreter, Ganga Singh Ji said, "You are known as Tiger, but have you ever shot one?" And believe it or not, Clemenceau landed up in India. Bikaner didn't have tigers. They organized a grouse shoot. Clemenceau went across to another princely state and shot a tiger. But Ganga Singh Bikaner conceptualized the idea of taking the waters of the tributaries of the Indus from the Punjab to Rasa. And this was actualized as late as 1974 when it was inaugurated. And this was later to be renamed after the third Indian Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi. So the idea that you take waters from one river basin into an area where there is no extant river, transform it by irrigating. It's a very important ecological milestone. To me, it is as significant as the creation of the canal colonies of the Punjab. Will completely transform the ecology of large parts of the South. So the remaking of landscapes for economic redistribution, transformation was important, both in terms of industrialization and modern agriculture, well before the coming of independence. It was not simply a dream of one bunch of industrialists in the Congress. It had much wider acceptance across the political spectrum. I would end by saying that the 1930s are a very important turning point. The remaking of imperial India and state society, which begins in the 1870s, has already run into major problems by the 1930s. And with the coming of the Second World War to British Indian Empire, the Second World War, of course, began a little earlier, 1931, when Japan annexed large part of Manchuria, large parts of China. But we would look at the Second World War as important because in the Second World War, production at all costs becomes the priority. The felling of trees in the forests is shown by Stebbing, the importance of projects like the DVC. In the Gromo Food Campaign, the Raj would depart from its age-old policy of denying firearms to the peasantry, post-1870 Arms Act, and distribute guns so that they could shoot wild boars and nilgai and sambar, which might rape the crops. And interestingly, it is precisely many of these policies, including the use of the killer of mosquitoes, chemical celebrated as savior. Its inventor had won the Nobel Prize, believe it or not, dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane, DDT, first sprayed in an area known as Kingsway, now called Kartavya Path, earlier called Rajpath, from the air. First aerial spraying ever of DDT in the world was over the Kingsway, as shown in the book by Srinath Raghavan, India's War. And with the coming of independence in India, large numbers of the refugees fleeing the horrific violence of partition was settled in the Tarai, and DDT and modern anti-malarial medicines, which had been tried out on soldiers in the Second World War, were distributed to them. The Second World War, of course, brought in huge numbers of American and Allied soldiers into India. When leaving, they sold off their jeeps. So the jeep, the dry gun battery, the cell, the torch were all available. And the transformations of the nature-human relationship in violent forms that got accelerated during the Second World War took on new shape in the years after independence. It was given particular edge by the drive to industrialize, and this growth at all costs, with some checks and balances. Some of the princely systems of conservation from above were now retrofitted. There were attempts, for instance, to protect certain large fauna like the lion. But this phase continues right into the 1960s and 70s. So I've tried to argue that we have to look at India Ecologica by seeing state building, social economic contestation and transformation as integral to looking at the ecology and vice versa. One cannot make sense of the environment in the larger sense if one doesn't take state-society economy relations into account. But in order to understand relations of power, hierarchy, domination, to look at notions of emancipation, upliftment, transformation, looking at nature either in terms of production processes, settlement, or in terms of how multiple organisms and waterscapes and landscapes affect the human condition and how people try to remake these environments. It's very critical to history. So we can't have history with the environment left out. We need history with environment as a center. But there's a second dimension. One can't grasp the nature of environmental dilemmas today without a sense of the past. It's difficult to find a golden age in the past, though it's human that we try to do so. It's a human attribute to look at a past as simpler. But many of the dilemmas, the conflicts, the opportunities, the conflicts, the contests of the present do not lie in imagining a past that probably never existed. They do not lie in emancipating ourselves because there's no escape. They certainly do not lie in trying to recreate. They lie in creatively, critically learning from it. And there's something very deep in environmental history. It's so simple that one tries to spell it out, it looks silly. So I'll end by taking refuge behind a parable, which is a true one. A great economic historian of Europe, Carlo Cipolla, was asked to write a short 800-word article on the most important change in the last 1,000 years of European history. It's a very brilliant man, written lots of fat books. In those days, people read fat books. They were not available in PDF form. And he wrote an 800-page piece, 800-word piece, which I regret I can't reference. And he said the most important change in the last 1,000 years of Europe was the introduction of the beam. He said the beam, or the legume, fixed nitrogen in the soil. It enabled the soil fertility to be regained quickly. It cut the period of fallow and led to the threefold system. So I think we need to look in our environmental past for the equivalent of the introduction of the beam. What are the key turning points in this history? That will give us a better sense of whether or not we are at a turning point, not only in our own day, but in our understanding of the relationships between environment and history. And looking at India may give us insight to looking at the world at large. Thank you. Sorry, I went well over time. My apologies.
No, you were well within it. Thank you so much, Professor Rangarajan, for such an insightful talk. In fact, that would be an understatement from my side. Now the floor is open to questions. We already have a question in the chat box, but he wants to pose the question himself. Akash Kumar, can you please unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor, for the lecture. It was very insightful. my question is this, that did the British know the damage that they were doing to ecology in the process of just issuing orders that you can hunt animals and then construct the canals, etc., etc.?
The notion of ecology we have is very different from the one they have. So the word ecology itself is a German word. It comes from the German scientist Haeckel, Ernest Haeckel, late 1870s. The canal colonies date to the 1840s, 50s, 60s. So it would be ahistorical to ask them what we are doing about the ecology. What we can say, however, is that certainly in the case of Awadh, when they were building canals there, the talukdars of Awadh gave a very interesting petition. And based on their own understanding of the agriculture, they argued that wherever you build a canal, please provide for drainage of excess water. Nobody listened to them because talukdars were seen then as now as an anachronistic, exploitative, parasitical, rent-seeking class, which, by the way, I think they were. So without notion of ecology in this sense, they did raise this. One should be very careful about using words like the British. There were probably at peak 150,000 Brits in India. 150,000 Brits and 300 million Indians. How did they govern? Can't tell you here. That requires a different lecture. One of the interesting things about 150,000 British, many of them were connected to official government. The largest number were 70,000 white soldiers. There was a small clutch of ICS officers. There were people in the police service. And very interestingly, people in the forest service. So let me go to the forest service. So you're asking about animal killing and shooting. As early as 1870s, since we are notionally in South India, there's a book by a man, very famous man, Sanderson, G.P. Sanderson, 13 Years Among the Wild Beasts of India. Looks like quite a horrific book. It's not. He's an outstanding naturalist. And he argued, we interest you, Akash, to see. He says, why are we waging a war on the tiger? Because the tiger is entitled to present a bill for his services. He argued that the cattle that were eaten by the tiger were diseased and old in any case. And that for every buffalo or bull that he killed, the tiger ate up a lot of deer and wild boars that attacked crops. So I think that there are elements of critique present among them. And one of the interesting things with them is, unlike many of us, they had very good handwriting. And if you read their Keep With Notes and their articles, there's a lot of constant debate. And these bounties, by the way, are discontinued by the 1920s. So yes, at times they were aware of the damage. At other times they were not. But these are being debated constantly. And it's interesting, some of the critical points which were made then are still relevant now. So if you look today at contemporary India, many states in India have made nilgai vermin or wild boar vermin. They are telling people you can go and shoot any. The same policy, it's there. Is that the wise way to do it or not? So I'd be a little hesitant, and perhaps they were less mindful of the damage, but that is probably true of a lot of decision makers in the present. Carlo Cipolla. I'll write it for you, the name. Cipolla is not spelt the way that it is said. His name is Carlo, which is easy. It's very famous. He wrote a book called On Guns and Sail Ships. Thanks.
Yeah. Professor Mahapatra and then Snehasish.
Okay. I think very fascinating talk, Mahesh. I think what struck me is this, looking at some of the issues in a kind of long durée, that long tunnel of history. The one that struck me was the sedentarization. If you look at right from the ancient history of India, for example, with the story of the state formation, sedentarization was, of course, happened in different places in India at different points in time. But the objective of the sedentarization was actually one of the reasons to expand agriculture. And the kings came with the Brahmins, came to the hinterland, and incorporated sometimes the communities there.
Yeah.
And then they were either in the long term incorporated into a caste structure or established some kind of symbiotic relationship. and so on. So sedentarization is a process which is going on even today. For example, 20 years ago, when I was in Rajasthan, I met communities who are really being sedentarized by government. They actually were the people who were selling salt, multani mitti, and they were given a piece of land, and they had their donkeys. And once they're sedentarized, the donkeys became a threat to people who had land. And now, so according to one story that I was talking to a group of people, they had to really take 250 of their donkeys into the forest and left them there, because the landed gentry in the areas, the big landlords threatened them. Look, if you keep your donkeys here, we will kill you. So what I'm trying to say is that the history of sedentarization, right from the ancient India to the stories that you said, there's something to say about the connection with the state, and the connection with the state. There's element of threat, element of not fully, these guys are not fully under the grasp of the state. They're not fully legible, to use a modern language. They're not eligible, they're legible for the state, and state wants some kind of legibility. And this is a very fascinating story that Mahesh, that you presented, which can also be traced back to an earlier period, and to see that process is still, no process is actually complete, because people are still defying the full sedentarization, although now state is almost imposing on people in the name of providing services, welfare, and your citizenship identity, which is based on certain kind of address. I don't know, how do you look at that long history? Because what you're presenting is a long history, but that really is quite fascinating, I thought.
So there are two new dimensions. One is the notion of sedentarized to civilized. The notion that the person who are not sedentary are savage is much more deeply ingrained among various sections of British. And it is also absorbed, assimilated by many dominant Indian groups. This is very interesting in the debate between Gurrier and Elvin in 1940s on the Sweden cultivators, the Baigas and others. And here it's important that the contribution of the foresters to this debate and the early surgeon botanists of the early 19th century, English surgeon botanists, is that they add a further dimension. They argue that people who are peripatetic in production, not necessarily settlement in the forest, are destructive of the forest. They damage the trees. They destroy regeneration. They harm the soil cover. The shifting cultivator as an enemy of the forest is a new dimension. And it continues in independent India. One of the difference with the Brahmadeya settlement, which we should not forget, many of those who settled were also brought into relationships of bondage and labor provision. Well, that also has a very interesting parallel. The bondage labor provision is there in what are known as the forest villages. Forest villages is with capital F and capital V. These are villages under forest department where everybody is a tenant at will and has to provide labor for cutting fire lines, for beats, for timbering. And even in early 2000s, there were 5,000 forest villages. Making them revenue villages is a major demand. This is a form of near indentured labor, legalized by the forest department, continued in independent India. And you're absolutely right. The sedentarization is a complex process. There are relative success stories. They're very rare. The very great historian of deep south of Tamil Nadu, Anand Pandian, has written Cultivating Virtue about the Kalars who are settled and who become rice cultivators. Very unusual group. Normally, the groups who are sedentarized undergo exactly what you have said. They are not prepared for the new livelihood. Whatever implements they are given, they are unable or unwilling to use them. The animal wealth is gone waste. Dr. Asmita Kabra has done a lot of work about Kuno, where the cheetah release is taking place. And she has shown that the Saharias and others, when they left, they released their cattle into the forest. They are still roaming there. And when they move into a new area, the gathering economy, for instance, here it is of Acacia Katechu. These are not peripatetic people. One may call them forest-reliant peoples. Similar situation. So these groups, there's a very interesting question. Should the settled cultivator be the normative model of developed society? It may interest you to know, in one of Nehru's letters to chief ministers, I don't have it here, he talks exactly about Rajasthan, saying these people who roam around place to place, let's settle them in one place. And this has been carried out very systematically in Kutch after earthquake. But you may be interested, there's a scholar called Anirudh Shet. He's not published, so I am just citing him. He's working on Maldaris of Kutch. What they have done, the houses, many of them, they are storing the grain in them. They don't live in the house. One member of family still moves with the cattle. And when government has given provision of fodder under Garib Yojana, they get a lot of fodder and store it for the winter. So there are ways in which these groups try to evade. But the reality is that these forms of production and settlement may be even more important at a time of climate change, because there are two things about them. They minimize risk. Their productivity may not be as high. Second, they're able to take advantage of shifting weather patterns. See, there's a history to the evolution of these systems, which is precipitation rates do vary. They vary over time. So Western India, I can say, Gujarat, Rajasthan, roughly speaking, 1 out of 3 years, there won't be any rain. Roughly speaking, over 100-year period. This is true in many parts of arid, semi-arid India. So these systems, I don't want to romanticize, they took account of certain long-term and seasonal variations in the landscape. And it would be very unfortunate if our modern society loses track of these knowledge systems. I don't want to romanticize. I'm not saying it's a great life. It's awful in many ways. So it's a very, very good question. Sorry. Go on, maybe.
Thank you.
Vijay Ram. What is the future of ecological conservation, not just wildlife conservation? We're witnessing increasing urbanization. Is human society going to handle future crises? Does ecology prevail over humans in the long run? I don't know, but I think you're onto something of enormous importance. I think India has some 200 cities with over 1 million people. It's very interesting. India is much more urban society than we think. The 2011 census gives us 35%. It may be much more. But the kind of urbanization is very interesting. It's urbanization without a large manufacturing base. It's got a service base. It's got a very large number of self-employed people. And it's got a large number of basic producers. So the vulnerability to these ecological changes is much greater because the margin of life in terms of in economic terms, whether you look at it cash surplus or surplus in calorie terms, it's very low. So we don't know. I don't know. I don't know that if ecology and humans can be separate. My view would be that productive, habitable, safe waterscape and landscape, which supports human society, as well as the complex agro-ecological systems in the widest sense, is vital, even for the modern manufacturing and service. The modern manufacturing service economy has to take account of both the material flows of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, the various noxious substances, oxides of sulfur, nitrogen. It also has to take account of ecosystemic life cycles. Were we not to do that, many of the landscapes we live in will become uninhabitable or unsafe or both. I don't want to be a prophet of doom, but please look at how exposure to floods has doubled in the last 10 years. Similarly, the exposure to unseasonality in terms of extreme events, wet and dry spells, has also increased. Adit, very good question. The concept of princely wilderness in South Indian princely states. I think it is very important, and not only in South India, but since you asked South India, very interesting work on Pudukottai by Joan Wagahorn, very rarely read book, and she showed that the Parni Hills, where the Maharaja Pudukottai, very rare prince in Madras Presidency, had very few Rajas. They maintained hunting grounds because the Vedans nourished the body of the king by supplying honey, fruits, and game meats. And I would argue that it's a question whether the modern elected leaders who protect this tiger, lion, gazelle, antelope, and want to be seen with them, is this a modern recreation in democratic terms, where in the princely system, their spiritual credits were drawn from the forest shrines and spirits. Today, they are deriving uh, popularity, particularly among the younger people, by being seen as a friend of the elephant or the tiger. And with rare exceptions like this Donald Trump and extreme right in US, this applies across the political spectrum in the world, but particularly in democracies. And I think in democracies, all the elected leaders want to be popular. And to become popular, you can say I'm friend of the tiger or the lion, or whatever. And the notion of princely wilderness has a second dimension, which we shouldn't forget. Princes protected wilderness through extremely coercive means. So Sadul Singh of Bikaner, who had record, he shot over 50,000 head of game. If you read the description of the hunt in his unpublished big game diary, it's a frightening attempt one day where one of the leopards in the beat turns around and mauls one of the beaters. The leopard is shot and he says, poor beater, yeah, I thought he'll lose his life. It looked like he'll lose only one arm. He, suffered all night and died. And then he says the leopard is responsible. It's a very ugly leopard. He was such a brute. No wonder he had such a bad temper and behavior. The utter indifference to the human suffering of the beater and this blaming the leopard's looks for his killing. There is, this is very judgmental of me, but the insensitivity both to human suffering and the animal. You see, the animal is being chased by a lot of beaters. It's in panic. It is defending itself when it attacks. The beater is also defending himself. Both are victims. Neither the leopard nor the beater had any enmity. There's a relationship of hierarchy where in order for the pleasure of the trophy, beaters are being taken away from their farm and housework. Unpaid labor at great risk. I mean, a leopard is a very dangerous animal. A leopard is an animal which hunts monkeys. Its ability to hunt a human being is much greater than a tiger's. It will know exactly what to do. I'm sorry to say this, very gory. So I sometimes wonder whether the modern conservation system could be much more sensitive to the human as well as the animal dimension. Both the plight of these animals, but also the very difficult life that people who live close to them are having. So there is very important work on princely wilderness. There isn't a full-length history on South India, but there is work elsewhere in India. I'm happy to discuss further with you. And there's need for more work on it. A good question.
Yeah.
I have one more.
Snehashish?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you,
Snehashish, you would like to go next? Yeah, please.
Yeah, and thank you, Dr. Rangarajan, Mahesh. This is such a lovely talk. I think I'm trying to collect some thoughts because my work was in the intersection of the urban and the environment. And there, many of the concepts that has been derived from the colonial rules, such as legality, encroachment, we have still, managed to use those and to illegalize people or to, reject their claims to land and the environment. And it is very interesting that recently there is a discussion on decolonization. Like recently, Pratap Bhanu Mehta wrote on Indian Express that how decolonization is being adopted by the right, and there was a counter to it in the Indian Express today. So while we are, decolonization is claimed by different camps, we still see that there is a, large continuance of colonial way of looking at land resources by the bureaucracy and by the elites, mainly coming from the urban, context. So I was wondering that, there are so many policy lessons in the significant amount of historical work that you discuss and including your work. But currently, as I'm working in a policy think tank, I'm not finding the right synergy or I'm not finding the right dialogue between these two particular domains. Like we just concluded the G20 and there was such a big about sustainability and environment. But that is, in a way, it's good that we are taking these commitments. India is signing up for this, taking the lead. But somehow I feel that there is not acknowledgement and therefore no taking lesson from the history. And I feel that I think both the groups must come together. And I think this is the initial thought I'm having. And I'm wondering that what would be your thought or what would be a way forward in kind of bringing this to historical research and the policy dialogue that goes on in today's contemporary world. How can they combine and, probably move ahead? Thank you.
So the decolonization as a political project and intellectual project. The scholars you're referring to, Dr. Mehta and Dr. Vikas Yadav, One was my colleague, one is me. I have the greatest respect for discipline of political science. But sometimes I wonder whether some of the political scientists, brilliant as they are, work with ideal type categories. One says, let us decolonize ourselves thoroughly. Please note the article is written in English. I am very serious. It's minority language in India. It is more distant from Indians than Farsi was in heyday or Sanskrit, or about as distant. The second has given a list of 3-4 thinkers. I am very struck by something else, and I want to step a little away. See, two major successor states in 20th century were revolutionary Russia and revolutionary China. They began with a clean break with the past. 1917 October Revolution. 1949 Mao enters China. You will agree with me, they attempted thoroughgoing transformation of their societies. But if you look at the Chinese state post-revolution, Russian or Soviet state post-revolution, any serious historian will show you remarkable continuities with Tsarist Russia and Kuomintang China. And the reason is all successor states build on past legacies. We should be very clear about this. There's nothing good or bad about it. It's inevitable. Are they conscious of that legacy? Therefore, in India, since the colonial period or imperial period was, depending where you live, around 200 years or around 100 years. So if you live in Naga Hills came under British rule only in 1891. Punjab came under British rule 1849. Malabar came in 1792, etc., etc., etc. But this long encounter with colonialism was not with a settler colony. India did not undergo what Australia, New Zealand, and United States, Canada underwent. Wholesale replacement of the indigenous population with white settlers. So that the indigenous population is a tiny percentage. This was not true in Central America, Mexico, and many of the Latin American countries. So in India, please note, it was not possible to have East India Company without 200,000 soldiers by 1800. In 1817, Hindu College was set up. It's the first modern educational institution set up by Bhadralok, upper class men in Calcutta. They spoke English as well as Bengali. Were they colonial or not? I don't know. They included the great Henry Vivian Derosio, who wrote To India, My Native Land. It's one of the most beautiful, moving passages on the glory of India. And we now know, because of work of Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee, how Derosio, who by the way was called a half-breed, mixed race, he could not even eat with the white members of the college. The Bhadraloks also sort of boycotted him, and he died penniless. So I think that there has been a lot of rethinking about what to draw from this larger encounter that is positive and not. Who was a better instance of this than Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi? In Hind Swaraj, he rejects Western civilization outright. However, please note, he is the only Indian nationalist who appeared before Hunter Commission of Inquiry into Jallianwala Bagh. He went and said his piece. He said they can be anybody, and he spoke there like a British barrister. And he was rewarded for his efforts by being expelled from the London bar in 1922. And kindly note, he was re-admitted in 1988. So British barrister. He mastered the law. And if you look at the way he negotiates, he is a first-class barrister. So I think that Indian encounter with West and British is much older than we think. I urge you to see the new book by Mukherjee and Sinclair and the other scholar who has just passed away, New History of India. There is a very interesting chapter on India and the world from the last 2000 years. They have come up to mid-18th century. They start in the first century of the Common Era. They could start even earlier. So Indian encounter with West is not simply British encounter. I would suggest, since you're looking at urban and natural, look at the great city of Bombay. Look at 3 historians. Mariam Dosal on water, Nikhil Anand on water in post-independent India, and Aditya Sarkar on the working class. Mariam Dosan shows many of these debates on water we are talking about today, they are anticipated in the imperial period. Some are not. Some are not. So Bartle Frere and the big debates about what to do with water, they're there in Bombay. So I think this is all very nice to say, let us dump all of colonial and make it decolonial and say so and so, so and so, so and so had all the answers. Nobody has any answers. The history doesn't give us answers. It gives us questions. It makes us think critically. So we should engage with the history and understand how we have come to the past. You talked about imperial concept on legality. So who was declared illegal and how and why and where? And by the way, there's a lot of patterns between the urban illegality and forest peoples, pastoral peoples, tribal peoples, fishers. In fact, many of them are inside the city. Look at the very interesting work done on the great city of Mumbai. I'm just sticking with it just as an instance. And the Varlis of Thane. Very interesting, that Sanjay Gandhi National Park. So these are not quite so different. Yes, that's the new history of India. The late, tragically gone Shobita Punja with Mukherjee and Singh. Can I have one last question? Then we'll... But thank you. It's a very, very important question.
Thank you.
I have a suggestion. You look at a very interesting book called Gandhi and His Critics, B.R. Nanda. It's got a fantastic article called Man and Machine. It's a brilliant piece. It's on what Gandhi thought and his critics thought. It's very short. It's 10 pages, but it's a distillate of the positions. They're very complex and sophisticated. And these guys may not have done PhD and they may not be in some think tank, but they are really engaging with complexity. So I'm delighted that you asked this. Very, I'd love to know more about this later. So I'm just putting my email. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, just wanted to hear your comments on like the prospect of coming together of history and modern policy making. Like, do you think that can we form the right synergy, and can we make? What do you think? Is it the right question that I'm asking, or like has it always been like this?
No, I think that the engagement with history is necessary for anyone who wants to think about the present. But I would suggest that that engagement be critical and self-informed and self-aware. If it's a sort of I told you so kind of history, it will be very unfortunate. This is how they did it right. Sure. So there's a lot of people now who think India should be governed as it was 2000 years ago. Great. Okay. Here's the reality check. 2000 years ago, Shumit Guha's estimate, the population of India was 14 million. That's the population of Delhi. Now, a population of Delhi of 14 million, there are a lot of options. Today, the population of India is 1.4 billion. The population of South Asia is greater than that of China, much greater. So if you add India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the smaller countries, much larger. Okay, to go further, density of population 2000 years ago was 5 per square kilometer. Today, it's 450 per square kilometer. So it's a completely different situation. In fact, if you look as late as 1881, population density is about, I think it's around 70 per square kilometer. The real surge is after the 1920s. After the 1920s, in many parts of India, land is abundant and labor is not. After the 1920s, labor is abundant and land is not. So what you're looking at is a very serious situation. Let me put it to you simply. Half the land is cultivated. So if you just for argument's sake assume cultivated land supports people, the land density is not 450 per square kilometer, it's 900 per square kilometer. So let's just round it off and say 1000. Okay, make it more complicated. In 1947, longevity was 32 years, male longevity. Today, it's 68 years. Then look at, very interesting, if you look at the last 20 years, good news. Indians are drinking more milk, eating more eggs, eating more poultry, eating more fish than before. That means the net nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium intake is greater. Correct. And by the way, I don't see why these people should become vegan. I'm not suggesting that. So the land required for that calorific intake itself and the water, how do you manage that? Now here there's something very important. This is where I think the past is useful. When you look at a longer term pattern in the past, how do they deal with risk? This is very critical. So you come to Bombay. So Amitav Ghosh has made very interesting point in his book, The Great Derangement. It's a brilliant point. I mean, it's really, great literature, comes to history, is also trained in history anthropology. And he says these three cities, Kolkata, Mumbai, and Chennai, are colonial cities. You know what's interesting? They are in close to high tide zones. Nobody built cities close to high tide zones earlier. They knew. Jawaharlal Nehru, this famous book, Discovery of India, has an incredible point. He says across the whole of North India, in the monsoon, the river floods. By the way, it's true of peninsula. So the river water will go up 50, 100, 300 feet. Before the colonial era, nobody built in the riverbed. Very simple. Don't build in the riverbed. It doesn't matter what you do. The water will break through. It's not rocket science. Everybody is doing it. This is happening in Pakistan and Bangladesh also. By the way, it's happening in the United States also. So I think there is a modern engineering logic where you think you can do these linear structures. But all you have to do is study the river flows over the last 100 years. But you know, the real estate of that land is very expensive. So this is about modern political economy. The history won't help you. Where the history can help is calculate the amount of insurance risk if you put it in. And this is happening right now. People are looking at insurance risk of New York, Bombay, Singapore. It's frightening if you look at global warming. If the water goes up 20 feet, what are you going to do? And the answer is very simple. Don't build in the lowland, build in the highland. It's not rocket science. So this habitable, safe, livable, productive environment, that can be a guiding principle. And I would argue that here you can have spaces for cooperation of rich and poor, better off and not so well off. But it should provide dignity, materially and human, for the less privileged. That's been something these societies have chronically, historically been very poor at. Let's face it. That's why there are so many poor people in India. It's because they didn't get that materiality and dignity. And some of the protective systems they had have been stripped away by this property regime, such as this hard forest regime or hard lines on, where the animal and person can go. Is that the right way? So we need to rethink. The IBM used to have a slogan in the day. It was the Big Blue. It had a hilarious slogan. Each IBM person you might add this. And it's fun of them. It said, think. Then if you said, what do you say now? They'll turn it around and say, Sochiye in Hindi to show that they are not anti. Sochiye. We're not thinking. We should start thinking. It's time to start thinking. It's rethinking. Sorry, it's not an answer. So I'm afraid I have to go to some very boring council meeting. So I have to ask to be asked. Thank you also.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. We're already time, and thank you for people. Thank you, Professor Rangarajan, for an outstanding talk. Thank you for reminding the centrality of animals, wild and tame both. How we treat the peripatetic people like pastoralists or other vagrants, and grand modernizing projects in irrigation or agrarian expansion in the centrality of state making and their influence on our environmental present. Thank you so much. We are looking forward to host many of the outstanding speakers as well as early career researchers with their work in comparative environmental history in our forthcoming sessions, which will resume again in November. Until then, thank you so much, Professor Rangarajan, and all the attendees who have stayed till the end of this session. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Mahesh, thank you.
Thank you,
Mahesh, thank you for coming and good luck.
Welcome. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.